Is it possible to forget your first language? Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on what part of this big wide world of ours you happen to be in right now. I am Julian Northbrook, and this is Doing English. Interesting question. Is it possible to forget your first language? The short, simple answer to that is yes, it is possible, but it is very, very rare, and it only happens in extreme cases when the right circumstances converge. For most of us, however, and this is now the beginning of the slightly longer, more complicated answer, what we experience as a forgetting of our first language is not actually a forgetting at all, but rather a dulling of our first language because of what is happening in our brain when we gain proficiency in our second language. But I am getting ahead of myself. The study of the forgetting of a language, whether first or second, is called language attrition. And we talk of first language attrition and second language attrition. And I guess in terms of research and work in psycholinguistics, language attrition can be considered the polar opposite of language acquisition. But again, as I said, what most people experience as a forgetting of their first language is not actually forgetting it at all, but rather it's simply that their second language has become stronger in their brain, and relative to that, they feel like their first language has dulled, has slowed down. The way that people might experience this is if, say, they live in an English-speaking country and they are using English, their second language, all day, every day. They're constantly speaking English, they're always exposed to English, they live their lives in English, and they always never use their first language. They will find it increasingly more difficult to recall words in their first language. And when it comes to having a conversation in their first language, they might find themselves unable to recall the word and thinking, oh, what is that word? It'll be on the tip of their tongue, but they won't be able to access it. And the really irritating part is that often you'll be able to remember that word in your second language, for example, English for you or Japanese for me, but you won't be able to remember it in your first language. And you'll be stood there like an idiot thinking, what's that word? I can remember it in my second language, in English, but I can't remember it in my first language. What was it? And again, it'll be like on the tip of your tongue, but it'll feel like it's missing somehow. People will also find that their brain kind of automatically fills stuff in, and they'll be speaking their first language and they'll want to insert words and bits from their second language. This is especially the case when it's something that doesn't exist in the first language. Whenever I go back to the United Kingdom, I find myself very, very frustrated whenever I go to a shop and buy something, because here in Japan, we have a standard expression for that kind of situation. Yoroshiku onegaishimasu or onegaishimasu. And you'll just walk up to the counter, say in the convenience store, hand them, I don't know, the bottle of water or whatever it is that you're buying and say onegaishimasu. Whereas in English, we don't have that kind of fixed expression for this kind of situation, and the term yoroshiku onegaishimasu or onegaishimasu has no translation equivalent in English. It can mean anything from please to please do this for me to please think favourably of me. It's used in all kinds of situations. So when I'm speaking English, I want to use that term because it's my habit. And it's frustrating when I can't, and my brain will be like, why can't I say this? Why can't I use this really convenient bit of language that I have from your second language? Well, because we're in England now and nobody understands Japanese. That's why, stupid brain. Yet another way that you may experience this, although it's not the forgetting of your first language per se, but rather change based on the way that your second language affects the first language, transfer from your second language to your first language, is that you may start to use unnatural or non-native like speaking patterns in your first language when you are very used to speaking in your second language. great example of this that I've noticed several times with Japanese people who have lived in English-speaking countries for a while is that they'll start to use the pattern one of my, which is very common and very natural in English, but they'll use it in Japanese, which is not natural and not common. For example, one of my friends, they'll start to say watashi no tomodachi no hitori, which in Japanese sounds a little bit odd, because again, it's an English-speaking habit, an English-speaking pattern, not a Japanese-speaking pattern. But what you've got to understand is that this is not forgetting your first language as such. Rather, it's to do with something called activation. You can watch this video for a detailed discussion on this, but basically it's a misconception that somebody who knows 2 languages is like a monolingual times 2. They're not. When you learn a second language, you are qualitatively different to a monolingual. This is because when you learn 2 languages and you have 2 languages in your head, those languages are always switched on, always active. And the result is that they are constantly fighting between each other. For example, say you see a car. Well, you have 2 separate words to describe this object, this thing. So when I see this car, in my brain, the word car becomes active, but so does the Japanese equivalent, kuruma. How does the brain know which one to choose? Well, basically the 2 languages fight between each other, and the one that wins out is the one that gets used, the one which gets understood. This is why occasionally, it's rare, but it does happen, you will be speaking, say, your first language, and you'll accidentally slip in a word from your second language, or vice versa. I remember once when I was teaching in secondary school, and I was telling the students about how I went to the zoo at the weekend, and I said something like, yeah, at the weekend I went to the Dorbutsuen, and it was really crowded, and all the students were just like, what did Julian just say? And then I realized, oh, shit, I said Dorbutsuen instead of zoo. It happens, but it doesn't happen that often. And the reason why is because the languages aren't just fighting between each other and whichever one wins, wins. The brain has a suppression mechanism called activation, which makes these languages stronger or weaker depending on what we are currently using. So if you are constantly speaking English, your second language, you're constantly exposed to English, your second language, it's like a seesaw. You will get better and better and better at English because your English will become stronger and stronger and stronger. And as your English becomes stronger, it suppresses your first language. And then, of course, if you are then exposed to your first language and using your first language, the seesaw goes the other way. And it's constantly going up and down, up and down, up and down, depending on what language you are currently using and exposed to. So anybody who ever learns a second language will experience some kind of dulling of their first language because, again, we are adding more cognitive processes to speaking and understanding the language, this competition between the 2. But if you are living in your home country and almost never use your second language, English, and you are always using your first language, you will probably never notice the difference. But if you are always using English, your second language, because you work in an English-speaking company, you go to an English-speaking school, or you live in an English-speaking country and you don't need to use your first language much, because of this seesaw effect, this balance between the 2 languages of activation, you will find increasingly you get this effect where you feel like your first language has slowed down, become dull, you start to forget words, you can't recall words, the tip of the tongue effect gets more pronounced and more common. This said, there are rare and quite extreme cases where people do forget their first languages. It does happen with brain damage. We're not going to talk about that here. That is a conversation for another day because it's a little bit different. But usually it happens when someone has left their home country and with it their first language as a child. Their first language wasn't fully developed anyway, and often there is some kind of psychological need to to get rid of the first language and fully integrate into the new country, the new culture, and the new language. For example, a kid going to school and getting bullied because they are different, because they have a different first language, for example, a different culture, and that kid desperately wanting to fit in, so they kind of shed their original identity and try as hard as they can to fully integrate into the new culture. This said, even then, it's debatable whether you ever actually forget that language or not, though. This is something that people have been arguing in the research literature for ages, but some people, and I'm inclined to agree, believe that you never actually forget language that has been learned, or indeed anything that has been learned. But even if it becomes completely inaccessible, we have no recollection of the language whatsoever, it is there, buried somewhere in the brain. Traces do remain. For example, there's very interesting research, extremely controversial, but very interesting research that's been done with Korean adoptees who left Korea at an extremely young age, completely forgot Korean, but when as adults they were put under hypnosis, that they were able to bring that Korean back to an extent, and this was supposed to have provided evidence for, again, language learnt always being somewhere in the brain, even if it's completely forgotten and inaccessible. Again, that research is extremely controversial though, but that's a story for another day. For most of us though, far from worrying about forgetting our first language, we are really struggling just to use and speak English as a second language without our first language getting in the way. If that's you, check out my Kindle book, Think English, Speak English, where I go into detail about why we end up translating from our first language to our second language, or as we are talking about here, sometimes from our second language to our first language, and how you can stop doing that as a second language speaker to speak English more smoothly, more naturally, and think in the language whilst you are doing it. Link in the description, or thinkenglish.speakenglish.com. If you found this video interesting and you'd like me to talk about topics like this more, let me know in the comments. And if you'd like to hear more about first or indeed second language attrition and not just acquisition, which is what most of us are concerned with, let me know about that in the comments too. Personally, I find this subject absolutely fascinating, and I would be more than happy to make more videos about it in the future if people are interested. Right, I think this is a good time to end this video. I've actually got a research paper that I've got to go and finish writing. So this is me, Julian Northbrook, signing off from another video. I'll see you at same time, same place, tomorrow for the next one. Thank you and goodbye. Before I go, if you are stuck thinking in your first language when you want to speak in English, watch this video for 3 reasons why. And watch this video for more about activation and answering somebody's question about why English is making the Dutch slow and worse than it should be.